The car pulled up to the gates of the house at around 6 in the evening. It was a black car, expensive and sleek, the kind that announced to the world that the person inside had money. The gates opened automatically, recognizing the vehicle, and the car glided up the long driveway lined with expensive landscaping and carefully maintained gardens. Everything about this property said wealth. Everything about it said success. His name was Vincent, and he was one of those people that most of the world had heard about, at least in passing. He was in the news sometimes, usually in the business section, usually because his company had done something significant. He was a billionaire several times over, the kind of person who had so much money that the numbers stopped meaning anything real. $30 billion looked the same on a balance sheet as $300 billion when you already had more than you could spend in a lifetime. Vincent stepped out of the car wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch was a brand that only people with serious money wore. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who had spent his entire adult life accumulating wealth and power, and all the things that were supposed to come with success. He walked toward the front door of his house, the kind of house that appeared in magazines sometimes, the kind of house that people used as an example when they talked about what money could buy. The columns at the entrance were marble. The doors were hand-carved wood. Every detail had been chosen by an expensive designer to create an impression of sophistication and power. But when Vincent reached the door, something unexpected happened. It opened before he could put his key in the lock, and there stood Catherine, his maid of 12 years. She was wearing her work clothes, and her expression was different from anything he'd ever seen on her face before. There was something firm in the way she was standing, something determined in her eyes. "Good evening, Mr. Vincent," she said. But she didn't step aside. She didn't move out of the doorway. Vincent stopped in his tracks. In 12 years, Catherine had never done anything like this. She was professional, efficient, and invisible in the way that good household staff are invisible. She came, she did her work, she left. She was respectful and polite, and she definitely didn't block the doorway to her employer's own house. "Catherine, what's going on?" he asked. He was confused rather than angry, at least for the moment. "Step aside, please. I've had a long day." "No," she said simply. Just like that. No doubt Vincent felt something flash through him. It was irritation mixed with confusion. He was tired. He'd been in meetings all day, dealing with numbers and negotiations and the endless machinery of running a billion-dollar company. The last thing he needed was whatever this was. "Catherine, I don't have time for whatever this is," he said. His tone made it clear that he was used to people moving out of his way when he wanted them to. "Please step aside." "I can't do that," she said. She was a woman in her late 50s, with gray threading through her dark hair, with lines on her face that came from years of hard work. She wasn't young, and she wasn't strong, but in that moment there was something immovable about her. She wasn't budging. "Is there an emergency?" Vincent asked. Now he was getting concerned. Maybe something was wrong with the house. Maybe there was a break-in or a fire or some kind of disaster that would explain why his maid was blocking his entrance. "No emergency," Catherine said. "Not the kind you're thinking of anyway." Vincent took a step back. He looked at Catherine more carefully, trying to understand what was happening. In 12 years, he'd never really looked at her. She was just there, like the furniture or the air conditioning. She was a service he paid for. She wasn't the person he'd ever really had a conversation with beyond giving her instructions about what needed to be cleaned. "Then what is this about?" he asked. Catherine took a breath. She looked like she was struggling with something, like she was making a decision that she knew would have consequences. "You can't go into this house right now," she said. "Not until we talk about something." "Talk about what?" Vincent was starting to get angry now. This was completely outside the bounds of what he considered acceptable behavior from someone who worked for him. She worked for him. He paid her salary. He owned this house. He could go wherever he wanted, whenever he wanted. "About what you are," Catherine said quietly. "About what you've become." That stopped him. That actually stopped him cold. He opened his mouth to say something, to tell her that she was out of line, that she should go home, that he would be calling an agency to find a replacement. But something in her eyes made him hesitate. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. But there was less certainty in his voice now. "I found something today," Catherine said. "While I was cleaning, I was organizing your desk, like I do every Thursday, and I found some papers. I wasn't trying to read them. I wasn't snooping. They were just sitting there, and I couldn't help but see what they were about." Vincent felt a small knot of something form in his stomach. He had a lot of papers. A lot of documents that contained things that might not look good if someone was reading them without context. "Catherine, those papers are private," he said. "You shouldn't be—" "I know I shouldn't be reading your personal documents," she interrupted. And that shocked him. Catherine had never interrupted him before. Catherine had never spoken to him with this kind of authority. "But I did read them. And I need you to understand something before you walk into that house and pretend everything is fine." "What papers?" Vincent demanded. "What exactly did you read?" Catherine pulled her phone out of her pocket, and she showed him a photo she'd taken. It was a letter, official looking, dated from about a week ago. He recognized it immediately. It was a legal letter from a construction company, a letter about a residential project his company had been involved in. A project in another state, a project that had been hastily shut down. Vincent felt his face go hot. "You photographed my private documents?" "Yes," Catherine said, and there was no apology in her voice. "Because what I read was important. That letter talks about people, families, people who lost their homes because the development deal fell through. People who paid money for houses that were never going to be built because your company pulled out of the project to chase a bigger profit somewhere else." "That's business," Vincent said automatically. "That's how business works. You pursue opportunities. You make decisions based on what's best for your company. It's how business works when you don't care who gets hurt," Catherine said. And now there were tears in her eyes, which made it worse somehow. She wasn't angry at him. She was sad. She was disappointed. That was somehow much harder to face than anger would have been. "I've worked for you for 12 years, Catherine continued. "I've cleaned your house, cooked your meals sometimes, kept everything running smoothly so you could go off and make your deals and accumulate your money. And in all that time, I've never said anything to you about what I think about how you live, how you treat people who work for you, the choices you make. I figured it wasn't my place." "It's not your place," Vincent said, but it came out weaker than he intended. "No," Catherine agreed. "But today, I found out something that made me think I couldn't stay silent anymore. I found out that the decisions you make, the money you chase, the deals you close, these things have real consequences for real people. And I realized that I've been helping you do this. I've been part of this system by working for you, by staying quiet, by pretending that what happens in your business life is none of my concern." Vincent didn't know what to say. He stood there in his expensive suit, looking at his maid. At this woman, he'd never really seen as a full person before, and he felt something inside him begin to crack. "So I'm standing here," Catherine said, "and I'm telling you that you can't go into this house tonight until you understand that there are people out there who are suffering because of you. Until you understand that your decisions don't just show up on a balance sheet. They show up in people's lives. They show up in children who are afraid their families are going to lose their homes. They show up in people trying to figure out how they're going to pay their mortgage when the deal they were counting on falls apart. Vincent looked past her, into his house, at all that marble and all that expensive furniture and all that evidence of his success. And in that moment, looking at it from the outside, it looked different. It looked empty somehow. It looked like the accomplishment of a man who had never considered the cost of his accomplishments. "I don't know what you want me to do," he said finally. "I want you to come in," Catherine said. "But I want you to come in knowing that there are people suffering because of you. I want you to think about that tonight before you sleep in your comfortable bed. I want you to understand that before we can talk about whether I'll keep working for you, you need to understand what you've actually done." She stepped aside then, opening the door fully, revealing the interior of his house. But somehow, stepping through that doorway felt completely different than it had ever felt before. It felt like he was walking into something that was going to change him, whether he wanted to be changed or not. Vincent didn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed, in his expensive master suite with its imported linens and custom-made furniture, and he stared at the ceiling. Catherine's words kept running through his mind, over and over like a song he couldn't get out of his head. "There are people suffering because of you." He kept telling himself that she was being unfair, that she didn't understand how business worked, that you couldn't build empires by worrying about every single person who might be affected by your decisions. But the words had landed somewhere inside him that he couldn't quite reach, somewhere that kept him awake and uncomfortable. The next morning, Vincent came downstairs to find Catherine in the kitchen. She was making coffee, doing her job like nothing had happened, like she hadn't turned his world sideways the night before. She was wearing her work apron, but there was something different about her now. She seemed larger somehow, more present, like she'd become a real person in his house instead of just part of the background. "We need to talk," Vincent said. He hadn't planned to say it, but the words came out anyway. Catherine poured his coffee into a cup, the way she always did, and set it on the counter in front of him. "Yes," she said. "We do. Sit down," Vincent said. It wasn't a request. He pulled out one of the kitchen stools, the kind Catherine would normally never sit on in front of him. For a moment she hesitated, then she sat. The simple act of her sitting while he stood felt like a reversal of something that had been happening for 12 years without him noticing. "Tell me about it," Vincent said. "Tell me everything. The development project. The families. All of it." Catherine looked at him for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out if he was genuinely interested or just trying to get information, so he could fix his public relations problem. Then she started talking. "I have a cousin," she said. "Her name is Helen. She lives in Pennsylvania, in a town called Riverside. About 2 years ago, your company announced a major residential development project there. They were going to build 120 new homes, modern homes, with good schools and parks and all the things that families want." Vincent nodded slowly. He remembered this project. It had been promising at first, but then they'd pulled out. He tried to remember why. Something about a better opportunity had come along. A shopping center development that was more profitable. "Helen and her husband saved for years," Catherine continued. "They put down a deposit on one of those houses. They were so excited. They already had 2 kids, and they were thinking about having another one. They were thinking that finally they could give their children a nice place to grow up. The schools were supposed to be excellent. The neighborhood was supposed to be safe." Catherine paused and looked down at her hands. "Then your company pulled out of the project. Just like that. The whole thing fell apart. The homes were never built. The money people had paid as deposits was supposed to be returned, but there were legal complications. There were disputes about who was responsible, and Helen's family got caught in the middle." "What happened to them?" Vincent asked. He found that he actually wanted to know. He actually cared about the answer. "They lost the deposit," Catherine said. $50,000 that they'd saved for years. They couldn't afford to put down another deposit on a different house. The prices in the area had gone up by the time the legal issues got sorted out. They're still living in the apartment they were renting before, still hoping to buy a house someday. But their kids are growing up in a small apartment, and Helen is growing older, and the dream of having her own home is getting further away instead of closer. Vincent felt something heavy in his chest. "I didn't know this," he said. "How would you know?" Catherine asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was just a fact. "You never asked. You made a business decision based on profit margins and projections. You probably didn't even think about the people who were counting on that development." "There were other people?" Vincent asked. "Lots of them," Catherine said. "I looked it up. There were over 200 families involved. Some of them found other houses eventually. Some of them are still waiting. Some of them gave up on the idea altogether and accepted that they would never own a home. And all of them went through financial stress and disappointment because your company decided that a shopping center development was more profitable." Vincent stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at his expensive garden, at the landscape that had cost thousands of dollars to design and maintain. He thought about 200 families, about children growing up without the homes they dreamed of, and he felt sick. "There's more," Catherine said quietly. Vincent turned back to her. "More? I looked into your other projects," Catherine continued. "I read about some of the business deals your company has made. There was a factory closure 5 years ago that left 800 people without jobs. The factory could have been saved, but your company decided it was more efficient to move operations overseas. Those people lost their livelihoods. Some of them lost their homes. Some of them moved away to find work, and families were separated." Vincent sat back down. His coffee was getting cold in front of him, and he didn't even notice. "And there was the apartment complex," Catherine said. "The one where you bought tenanted buildings, and then raised the rent so high that most of the long-term residents couldn't afford to stay. They called it redevelopment, but what it really was pushing poor people out so you could rent to people with more money. I read about an 80-year-old woman who had lived in one of those buildings for 40 years. She had to move in with her daughter because she couldn't afford the new rent." "Catherine, these are business decisions," Vincent said, but his voice sounded weak to him. "These are standard practices, and I know they're standard practices," Catherine interrupted. "That's not the point. The point is that these standard practices hurt people. And you've been making these decisions for years, for decades, and you've never once thought about the real people those decisions affect. You've been so focused on the numbers that you forgot that the numbers represent real lives." Vincent felt something rising in his throat, something like anger, but also something like shame. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" he asked. "Why wait until now?" Catherine looked at him directly. "Because I'm a maid," she said. "And in this world, a maid doesn't tell a billionaire businessman what to do. I come, I clean, I leave. I don't speak up because I need this job. My grandchildren depend on the money I make. And I've been quiet for so long that I almost forgot it was even an option to speak." "But you did speak," Vincent said. "I did," Catherine agreed. "Because I have a cousin whose dream is falling apart, and I have a daughter who works as a social worker and sees the results of decisions like yours every single day. She sees families struggling because the jobs disappeared. She sees homeless people who used to have homes until they couldn't afford them anymore. And one day she was talking to me about a family she was trying to help, and I realized that I was working for the kind of person who was making her job harder. I was part of the system that was hurting the people she was trying to help." Vincent put his head in his hands. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. The question came out sounding small and lost. "I don't know," Catherine said. "That's something you're going to have to figure out. But I think the first step is to stop pretending that your business decisions are just numbers. They're not. They're people's lives, their dreams and hopes and plans for the future. And when you make decisions that destroy those things, that makes you responsible for the destruction. Vincent looked up at her. "Do you want me to fire you?" he asked. "Is this about getting severance?" Catherine looked genuinely shocked by the question. "No," she said. "I'm not looking for money from you. I'm looking for you to understand what you've done. I'm looking for you to stop and really think about whether this is how you want to live your life. Because you have the power to do things differently. You have the resources to make decisions that help people instead of hurting them. But you have to want to do that first. You have to care enough to try." Vincent sat there in his kitchen, in his expensive house, surrounded by all the evidence of his success, and he felt like he was seeing it all for the first time. He felt like Catherine had pulled back a curtain and shown him something he'd been deliberately ignoring his whole life. "I need to meet them," he said suddenly. "I need to meet Helen. I need to meet some of the people from the development project. I need to see what I did." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll set it up. But Vincent, you need to understand that no amount of apologies is going to fix everything. Some things, once broken, can't be completely repaired. All you can do is stop breaking more things and try to make what you broke a little bit better." Vincent nodded. He didn't trust his voice to speak. He just sat there and let that truth settle into him, heavy and real and impossible to ignore. 3 days later, Vincent found himself driving to Pennsylvania in his own car instead of having his driver take him. He wanted to be alone with his thoughts. Catherine had arranged the meeting, and she sat in the passenger seat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, watching the highways stretch out in front of them. They drove for hours, leaving behind the city and its expensive neighborhoods, and entering into smaller towns and working-class areas. The landscape changed gradually. The houses got smaller. The cars on the road were older. The shopping centers were less fancy. This was the America that Vincent had spent his life ignoring. The America that existed outside the bubble of wealth he'd built around himself. They pulled up to a small house with a neatly kept yard, but a roof that needed new shingles. There was an older car in the driveway, the kind that still worked but probably wouldn't for much longer. Vincent sat in the car for a moment, not ready to get out, not ready to have this conversation. "Ready?" Catherine asked, gently. Vincent shook his head. "No," he said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." Helen answered the door herself. She was a woman in her 50s, with tired eyes and a careful smile. She looked like she'd spent her life working hard and getting less than she deserved. Catherine had already called ahead, so Helen knew who Vincent was. Knowing and being ready to meet him were two different things. "Come in," Helen said. She didn't sound particularly warm, but she wasn't hostile either. She was just practical. A woman doing what needed to be done. The inside of the house was clean but crowded. The living room was small, with old furniture that was well maintained but worn. On the wall were framed pictures of children and grandchildren, evidence of a life lived with family at the center. Helen gestured to the couch, and Vincent sat down. "Thank you for seeing me," Vincent said. He felt like an intruder in this space, like he didn't belong here. "Catherine said you wanted to understand what happened," Helen said. She sat across from him in an armchair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap like Catherine's had been in the car. "I'm not sure what understanding looks like at this point, but I'll tell you the story." What followed was the most difficult conversation Vincent had ever had. Helen told him about the moment she and her husband first heard about the development project. She described how excited they were, how they went to see the model homes, how they picked out the lot where their house would be built. She talked about the deposit, the money they'd saved for years. $500 here, $1,000 there. Money they'd put aside instead of spending it on things they wanted because they had a dream, She told him about telling her children. She described her 7-year-old son drawing a picture of the house he was going to have, with a big backyard and a room of his own. She talked about her daughter, who was 10 then, telling her friends at school about the move, about the new neighborhood, about finally having space to breathe. Then she told him about the day the news came. The development was canceled. Just like that. The company was pulling out. She told him about sitting at the kitchen table with her husband, reading the letter, not understanding what it meant at first. She described the sick feeling in her stomach when she realized that the money they'd saved was gone, that the dream they'd been building was gone. "We had to tell the kids," Helen said, and her voice cracked a little bit. "We had to tell them that the house wasn't happening, that the backyard they'd been imagining wasn't going to exist, that everything we'd worked for was just gone." Vincent felt tears starting in his eyes, but he didn't look away. He didn't let himself look away. "It took 5 years," Helen continued, "before we got any of the money back. 5 years of legal battles and disputes and arguing with your company's lawyers about whose fault it was. During those 5 years, my kids grew up. My daughter didn't get the new school she was supposed to get. My son didn't get his backyard. I didn't get the house I'd been dreaming about since I was a young woman." She paused and looked at Vincent directly. "Do you know what it's like?" she asked. "To have a dream and watch it die because someone made a business decision? To know that your dream wasn't important enough to protect? That your hope, your plans, your family's future, all of that was worth less than whatever profit your company could make somewhere else?" Vincent couldn't speak. He tried, but no words came out. "The thing that makes me most angry," Helen said, "isn't the money. Yes, we lost $50,000, and that's a lot of money for people like us. But it's not just the money. It's the feeling that I don't matter, that my family doesn't matter, that the things we want, the things we work for, the dreams we build our lives around, none of that matters if it gets in the way of someone else's profit." After Helen's house, Catherine drove Vincent to meet other people. There was a factory worker named Thomas who had lost his job when Vincent's company closed the facility. Thomas lived in a smaller house now, one that his family had been forced to move to when his wife had to find work and they could no longer afford their mortgage. He was working part-time now, doing different jobs, never quite making enough. The worst part, Thomas told Vincent, wasn't the money, though that was bad. It was the identity. I was a skilled worker. I'd been at that factory for 19 years. I was good at my job. I knew my coworkers. We had a community there. When the factory closed, all of that was just gone. I became unemployed. I became someone who couldn't provide for his family the way I'd planned to. I became less than I was. There was a woman named Patricia who had been pushed out of her apartment building. She'd lived there for 40 years, since she was a young bride. The building had memories for her, the place where she'd raised her children, where she'd buried her husband. When the rent jumped, she couldn't afford to stay, and she'd had to move in with her daughter, sharing a bedroom in someone else's house at an age when she should have been living her own life. I understood that you wanted to improve the building, Patricia told Vincent. I understood that you wanted to make money. But what about the people who lived there? What about giving us time to adjust? What about trying to keep some of us? I paid my rent on time for 40 years. I was a good tenant. But I was poor, and in the end, poor people don't matter to people like you. Vincent listened to story after story. He heard about people who had lost jobs, homes, dreams, security. He heard about families that had been fractured, about children who'd had to change schools, about elderly people who'd lost the communities that had given their lives meaning. And as he listened, something shifted inside him. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like the sun setting. It was the slow realization that he had built his wealth on the backs of these people. that every dollar he had represented someone else's loss, that every smart business decision he'd made had been smart for him, but devastating for someone else. On the drive back to the city, Vincent was quiet. Catherine didn't push him to talk. She just let him sit with what he'd learned, let him process the weight of it. Finally, as they were getting close to the city, Vincent spoke. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "You can't fix it all," Catherine said. "Some things are broken and they'll stay broken. Some people's lost years aren't coming back. Some dreams died and they're not going to be resurrected. But you can stop breaking more things. And you can try to make some of it better." "How?" Vincent asked. "How do I make it better?" "That's your reckoning to figure out," Catherine said. "But I think you start by admitting what you've done. Not hiding behind business language. Not pretending it was just the way things work. You admit that you hurt these people, and you think about what responsibility looks like." Vincent nodded slowly. He understood now that Catherine had given him a gift by blocking his door. She'd given him the chance to see himself clearly, to understand the cost of his success. Not all people got that chance. Not all people were willing to take it, even when it was offered. "I want to do something," he said. "Something real. Not just charity. Something that actually helps." "Then you need to listen to what these people need," Catherine said. "Not what you think they need. What they actually need. And then you need to figure out if you're willing to sacrifice some of your own comfort to provide it." Vincent looked out at the city skyline appearing in the distance, at all the evidence of his success, and he felt like he was seeing it for the first time. He felt like everything had changed, even though nothing had changed, except his understanding of what the things around him really meant. He understood now that Catherine's act of blocking his door had been an act of mercy. She had stopped him from walking into his comfortable life and pretending that everything was fine. She had made him see, and once you see something, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to innocent ignorance.